I'm going to spotlight John, which will unmute you then, John, so you don't need to do anything. And I am going to start with a reading from the Sage's Tao Te Ching, which is wisdom for our later years. And it's called, There is Always Something More to Learn. Age brings a gentle humility to life. No longer defensive and afraid, we can move easily through the day. Mistakes no longer immobilize us, but merely deepen our wisdom with the hopeful message, there is always something more to learn. The mind of the expert is narrowly trained. The mind of the sage is opening wide. We are not becoming experts. We are just finally becoming good students. There are so many wonders yet to see. Don't waste today on reinforcing your views and opinions. Learn something wholly new about your spouse, your child, your friend, your world. John, welcome and go ahead.
Thank you, thank you. I'm not really used to speaking for extended periods of time, so I hope you'll forgive me for reading most of this. I am told I was born in Columbus, Ohio in the spring of 1944. My parents had been trying to have children for a couple of years and were pleased to be able to adopt me. The story I tell myself is that a soldier got his girlfriend pregnant in 1943 and then went overseas and got killed, so I was put up for adoption. I consider myself lucky to have had caring parents who wanted me, and I have made no attempt to find my biological parents. My first memory was when my alcoholic doctor, Uncle Jerry, convinced my parents I should have my tonsils removed early at age 2. I remember a giant mask coming down over my face, spewing vapors that made me gag, and I thought I was about to die. I didn't. My salesman father was transferred to the Buffalo area when I was 5, and we settled in Hamburg, a small town of 5,000 folks back then, about 20 miles south of Buffalo. I think even at age 5, I showed a glimmer of being a techie. My parents had a large console radio that developed problems, so they called the repairman to come to the house. I was curious, and I looked at the back of the radio and saw a string hanging down that looked odd. There were a couple of small pulleys in there that looked to me like the string should fit on it, so I put it back. When the repairman came by, he declared that the radio seemed to be working fine. I heard that and said, yeah, I guess I fixed it. Age 5. As I got older, I read many Tom Sawyer books about a young detective and scientist and had my parents get me a subscription to Popular Mechanics magazine. My first project was to design and build a boat. My parents let me do it. What I built was much taller than it was wide, and it immediately tipped over. In another of those issues, I saw plans for a self-propelled rototiller that seemed to me like it could be adapted to propel a car. So I saved up for a used lawnmower motor engine and sacrificed my red wagon, and at the age of 11, I built myself an early version of a go-kart. I gradually improved it with steering wheel, brakes, and lights, and was the terror of the neighborhood sidewalks for several years. Although quite crude, I was really proud of it, as it was really my effort since my father wasn't mechanical at all. I drove it frequently to my friend's house several blocks away, as I wasn't particularly athletic. One downside to my tech proclivity was when I was 12, I was making a rocket in my basement, and it exploded with a very loud bang, filling the basement with smoke and freaking out my mother. That may also have been the start of my hearing problems. My father was a non-practicing Catholic, and my mother got to raise me as a Methodist, but we were okay with dancing and some alcohol use, so it wasn't a big problem. At 14, I scheduled a talk with my minister, as the Methodist Church doctrine didn't seem to provide much guidance on life goals. He asked me what I wanted out of life, and I said I didn't really know at that point, but I'd like to have a Corvette. That session wasn't very satisfying, and I gradually fell away from organized religion. I was rather nerdy and did well in school, which amazed my adoptive parents, as scholarship hadn't been their thing. The first 3 years of high school, I had a girlfriend that I enjoyed going places with, but never got around to kissing. I matured sexually rather late, around age 17, and I did try to make up for lost time. Looking back, I see how privileged I was being white and male, as I was automatically assigned to the college prep track in high school without even asking for it. My guidance counselor suggested I might be interested in a summer science camp at Northwestern University after my junior year, and my parents luckily supported me going there. I had flourished in Hamburg as a medium-sized fish in a small pond, but at Northwestern, I was kind of shocked to find myself a backbencher among the cream of students from across the nation. In the 1950s, Russia had beat us into space, and the call went out for more US engineers. Since I was good at math and science, being an engineer seemed appealing, and it was promoted as a safe, steady employment, so I applied to engineering colleges. I knew Northwestern had a good tech school and a good co-op engineering program, so I ended up there. My parents moved to Rochester just before I graduated from high school, so I came here for that summer. Early that summer, I met Bonnie, who I fell hard for and was then devastated when she blew me off when we went off to separate colleges. I think that kind of thing happens to a great many of us. The engineering curriculum at Northwestern was quite demanding, and I found I could do well only if I spent all but a few hours a week doing homework. I got a co-op job at Bausch & Lomb Research Labs here in Rochester, so I regularly came back and lived at home. While at Northwestern, I did have several girlfriends, but hadn't found quite the one. At Northwestern, I was enrolled in a general engineering science program, mainly because I didn't know what kind of engineer I really wanted to be. And as graduation rolled around, I feared I didn't know enough about any one area to actually sell myself. So I applied to graduate school and was lucky enough to get accepted at the Materials Science Engineering Department at Stanford. I also was I was not accepted for nuclear engineering, and I'm glad that I wasn't at this point. Stanford was even more competitive than Northwestern, but I stuck with it. I was lucky that in the 60s, the government was more into funding education, and my scholarship covered my expenses. Young people aren't so lucky these days. I happened to go with my roommate to a mixer at a small girls' college up the peninsula and met Jody. We got along well, and since we had very similar SAT scores, I calculated that we should be compatible. This was the late 1960s, and my age group was given just 1 year of deferment from military service to do graduate work. I stalled long enough to get my master's and applied all over the country seeking a job that might have the possibility of a job deferment, so I could avoid going to Vietnam. My advisor had suggested that I look at a small startup electronics company, but I thought that sounded risky, so I skipped it. The name of that company was Intel. One of the companies I did apply for was Kodak Research Labs. When I showed up, they were very interested in my master's project and offered me a job right on the spot. Sounded good to me, so I joined Kodak in 1969 and did in fact get a job deferment. Once I settled into Rochester, I went out and bought a Corvette. So that life goal was satisfied early. I kept in contact with Jody, and when she graduated, she came to Rochester. We got married in the Catholic Church, which was her background. I found some liberal friends at Kodak, and one of the projects they got me into was voter registration in the inner city. Registration at the time was very onerous, since you had to go downtown to the Board of Elections weekdays if you happened to miss the one day in the fall that it was available in the neighborhoods. We got a grant to have a van to take folks to the Board of Elections during the day, and we worked with settlement houses getting folks willing to do that. On days off, I helped scour the streets in the Northeast and Southwest Crescent, talking to Black and Hispanic folks about voting. People were mostly friendly and not as threatening as my father had led me to believe. They were also not very well informed. I found walking the gray streets among dilapidated houses very depressing, and wondered why people wanted to live there. It took a while to dawn on me that they didn't have a choice. They or their parents didn't have the financial resources to get training to get good jobs, or even if trained, racism limited job prospects. This was still a time of redlining in Rochester, so real estate agents didn't show Black or brown folks houses in the supposed good suburbs. Being adopted, I think it was more easy for me to picture myself growing up in a different family and not having the opportunities that I had experienced. That seemed grossly unfair, so I felt compelled to work to change it. One of my efforts was to get signatures on petitions. One of the group efforts was to get signatures on petitions to the State Board of Elections to expand registration hours. Working mostly in Midtown Plaza, we collected 50,000 signatures from Rochester and did actually get the state to allow evening hours. During our planning, we happened to come to First Unitarian Church or some meetings because they allowed us free meeting space. I noticed stuff on the social justice bulletin board, and hey, the thought occurred to me that I might actually be comfortable coming here on a Sunday. Jody was willing to try something new, so we experienced a few of Reverend Gilbert's exceptional sermons and soon signed the book, because that was all it took to be a member then. Jody and I eventually both became active in Social Responsibility Council, SRC. Back then, we would regularly invite interesting speakers in, and we'd get revved up about a new project they were talking about. Of course, next month, we would discover a whole new project to redirect our attention to, and that made it hard to coalesce around any particular issue. Luckily, Reverend Gilbert's doctoral thesis was on how to involve a local congregation in social justice work, and he proposed the task force system, which we rapidly adopted with the great help of Allison Wilder. That system was adopted for many years as the UUA model for large congregations. We have since had to modify it to be consistent with policy governance and the responsibilities given to the senior minister. My marriage to Jody proved to be not as great as calculated and mostly frustrating. My parents had a reasonable relationship, but didn't deal well with feelings. My father, in fact, would regularly lose his temper every 3 months and shout and make a fool of himself. So I decided early on I was not going to be like my father. I would not let emotions control me, and I worked to keep emotions totally clamped down and under control. Needless to say, I wasn't a great partner, and we split up after 3 years. I did begin working on that, and I want to thank the UU denomination for being the place where I could meet other women that I had much in common with. I have met all my successful partners since then at the church or at Unicamp. I met Mickey Smith around 1974 in an encounter group at church, and we ended up together for 27 years. It seemed that a legal marriage might lead to control issues among us, so we actually just lived together that whole time, and I helped raise Andre, her son from a previous relationship. Another aspect of my social justice work I was drawn to was demonstrations and protests. My first big protest was a throw the bum out rally in Washington, D.C. to push for removing Nixon. It really felt invigorating to be part of a national political action. The term of President Jimmy Carter gave few reasons to protest, but when Ronnie Reagan came in 1980, the fun started again. I was active in the church and the community trying to stop the U.S. military attack on Nicaragua and stop the U.S.-funded terrorist groups, the Contras, who targeted civilians in Nicaragua. I participated in a lobby visit to Representative Barbara Conable to ask him to not fund the Contras. It seemed like a big deal at the time to be in the federal building, but that now has come to be pretty routine. Reverend Dr. Gilbert continued to be a great motivation for me. His sermons and writings led to him being known as the social justice conscience of the denomination. This happened to attract some really great student ministerial interns to the church. One I particularly remember was Kaki McTeague. She was also active in Central America work, and she talked a couple of us into going on a Witness for Peace UUSC delegation to Nicaragua in 1987. Witness for Peace wanted to bring Americans directly to experience the situation in Nicaragua so we could counter the Reagan lies. We actually went to regions of Contra activity to interpose ourselves between villagers and the Contras, based on the assumption that killing Americans would be really bad PR for the Contras. So we traveled by rickety buses and trucks to a small remote village that had just seen Contra activity. As we drove in, the sound of gunshots were heard, and this became real to us in a flash. How much did we really value Nicaraguan lives relative to our own? Luckily, we all found the courage to get off the bus and begin searching for where the shooting was occurring. After 10 tense minutes, one of the villagers told us the gunshots were just their friends shooting fish with their rifles. So we were able to get our blood pressure back under control. Villagers were happy to have us there, but we soon learned that there was barely enough rice and beans stored in the town to last a week. When I got back to Rochester and happened to go to the Wegmans superstore and see piles of food overflowing the tables, it seemed basically repulsive to me and was emblematic of American gluttony. I've always thought of myself as a rather private person, but social justice work increasingly required me to stand up and speak out. In the late 1980s, I agreed to co-facilitate a 6-session course on Central America that UUSC put together. I then went on to be the upstate New York regional coordinator at UUSC. And then I got Jack Manloff to take over that position. I also found myself volunteering to teach an anti-globalization course in the 90s. In 2001, I went with the local Catholic worker group to trespass at Fort Benning, where they were training the Central American military units the best way to torture priests and assassinate village leaders at the School of the Americas. The gathering outside the gates culminated in a very moving, solemn march onto the grounds where we faced arrest. These protests are times where I feel truly alive and part of something larger than myself. Of course, protests don't by themselves necessarily need to change, but they do inspire folks to continue the patient, long-term work of writing letters and speaking with legislators that does bring change. Outside the church, I connected in the 1970s with Metro Justice, Metro Act at the time, and found their mission to work on social, racial, and economic justice very consistent with my interests, so it became my center for secular social justice work. I drifted into administration and ended up being their treasurer off and on for over 20 years. Around the year 2000, Reverend Gilbert was involved in setting up Interfaith Impact of New York State to put progressive religious values to work at the state level. And I eventually pitched in and became treasurer of that also. I'll spare you the details of other protests I attended in New York City, Washington, D.C., Miami, elsewhere. I will just add that facing police or troops with helicopters hovering overhead was very tense, but it did make me feel really alive and connected to life. I've had people standing next to me get arrested, but so far I have not been arrested myself. I am not all social justice or work. In the winter, I've been able to ski most years, at least up till this year. And in the summer, I have a small vegetable garden and take rides on my motorcycle. I had it out yesterday. The few occasions when I experienced deep powder skiing out west were peak experiences, which really made me feel truly alive and made my body tingle. I can see how that really would be addictive. My Kodak career was as a photographic scientist, very complex discipline. And I started in the Emulsion Research Building number 59, started out on the 4th floor. I eventually moved to the 5th floor and ended up at the top 6th floor eventually. I was in the same division for 32 years with many fellow UUs here at the church. Glenn Webster, Carl Thomas, Gene Oliver, Joe Simpson, John Solberg, Al Milliken. And at least John and Joe are still around to keep me honest. I felt it was a great environment, and I had mostly interesting jobs and was able to attend conferences in the US, England, Europe, Hawaii, and present some papers. My name ended up on 11 patents, and a couple of them actually got used. In 2002, when digital was deeply encroaching on wet photography, Kodak offered me and others, would you leave if we gave you a year's salary? And with little hesitation, I said, yes. And I've celebrated that decision ever since. Unfortunately, 9 months after I retired, Mickey suffered a heart failure and died unexpectedly, so my plans were upended. She had been doing animal rescue work, and we had 25 animals, cats, dogs, and ferrets in the house that I was suddenly responsible for. That was fun. After settling into single life for 6 months, I happened to attend a joint Friday Night Flicks UU singles group evening and ran into one Linda Hazel. Thanks again to the UU denomination for screening for compatible partners. On our first date, the gong went off and I felt, this is the one. Luckily, she agreed and we got married in 2005. The past 15 years with Linda have been the happiest of my life. Being retired, I can engage in however much social justice work I want to fit in. I didn't learn to say no soon enough and ended up a bit overcommitted, with a peak being volunteer treasurer for 6 organizations at once. I backed down to 2, so that is under control. I am still able to stay engaged in the world and am particularly focused on dealing with global warming. I'm active in New York Renews, among other groups. That is the group, the statewide coalition that oversaw passing the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act last year, It is now pushing for the Climate and Community Investment Act, which will make polluters pay and will then fund a just transition to a renewable economy. We really need that. And in the last 2 weeks, I participated in 5 lobby visits to state legislators around climate and taxes. The last 2 were set up by New York Youth Climate Leaders Group, and they were led by an amazing young Brighton High School junior. Don't give up on the planet quite yet. I can feel age slowing me down a bit, but life remains interesting, and I have much to look forward to. Thank you for hearing my story.
And thank you for telling it, John. It's really, there is a lot that I did not know, and some that I did. I mean, I knew that you skied because we were at Tremblant during the ice storm of '91. Do you remember? And Mickey was calling you and saying, the heat's off and the electricity's off. What do I do? And we're up there eating and skiing and having a ball.
We decided to stay an extra day rather than come back home into that. we were without heat for like 13 days. Our area had gotten so
I am going to switch to I'm going to take the spotlight off you and switch to gallery view.